Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.64, To New York or to Virginia? If we sit down and try to evaluate the state of the American Revolution in the spring of 1781, we end up with a bit of a mixed bag. On the positive side of the ledger for the Americans, they had managed to push Cornwallis and the British around pretty well in the South. Enough that by the beginning of the summer, the British had essentially given up all hope of winning the war in the Carolinas, instead fixing their gaze to the north, on Virginia. It was not as though Nathanael Greene was winning all of his battles. He wasn't. But he was extracting enough of a price in losing that the British victors were often the ones left reeling. On the other hand, the United States was still stuck with virtually worthless currency. Mutiny had plagued Washington's Northern Army that winter, and now heading into the spring, there was anything but a clear plan on exactly what was going to come next. Oh, and yeah, let's not forget that one of the best generals that the Americans had in the entire war to date had just invaded Virginia and chased its governor, Thomas Jefferson, out of the governor's mansion and sent him running for his life. So, on the whole, not great. This week, we are going to spend our time looking at those spring and early summer months of 1781, where both the Americans and the British were hard at work figuring out exactly what the plan is. How do they plan to strike? The American Revolution was 6 years old in 1781, and everybody was absolutely sick to death of it. The Americans had spent years living with the war all around them. The economy was in tatters, and shortages had stretched everybody to, and often past the breaking point. This was a time of misery for the American population that was desperate for a return to normalcy. The British, however, were not exactly faring that much better. Here they were, 6 years into a war against what they kept reassuring the king was a small number of rabble-rousers. Yet, somehow, this small group of rabble-rousers sure seemed to be giving the British fits. Their Northern Army was a long-distant memory. Clinton was in control of New York in the north, but little else. In the south, their hold on the Carolinas and now even Georgia were slipping away. There was no other way to put it. The war was going poorly. Of course, one of the defining elements of the American War of Independence was that the British were fighting isolated from the rest of the world. Back during the 7 Years' War, the British had allies, countries fighting alongside them with similar aims. In future years, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British would again find themselves with numerous allies as a member of a grander coalition. In this war, though, the British were mostly fighting the battle alone. Even if we accept the idea that the American alliances were more of an effort to poke the British in the eye than any great desire from other nations to secure American independence, they were allies all the same. In the case of Spain, the Spanish did not even recognize the Americans because of the implications for their own colonial holdings. But they too, as we are going to see shortly, played an important role in the eventual triumph of the United States. With everybody growing tired of the ongoing conflict and the money pit that it had become, it raised an eyebrow when Catherine the Great of Russia and Emperor Joseph II of Austria, who, spying an opportunity, reached out and offered to mediate a peace. This, however, introduced new problems and brought with it realities of the alliance that the Americans had entered into. Now, as mentioned a moment ago, the Spanish were not even fully acknowledging the Americans in the war, although it is noteworthy that they did, albeit quietly, provide financial assistance to the Americans. The French were in the war to avenge themselves from their loss in the 7 Years' War, far more than they were in it for the security of the Americans. If the British lost their North American colonies, it opened up all kinds of new possibilities when it came to favorable trade agreements with the United States, hopefully to the great detriment of the rival British. Well, it was basically agreed that American independence was going to be a prerequisite for a peace. The French had their own objectives and ends that they were hoping to achieve. With the Russians and Austrians showing willingness to step in, the French quickly showed their willingness to settle the war under the principle of uti possidetis. What this policy basically boils down to is a diplomatic way of saying finders keepers. More specifically, it means that whatever you are holding when the peace comes is what you keep. French Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Comte de Vergennes, was open to settling the conflict based on what the map looked like at the beginning of 1781, with the exception of New York, which logically would have to revert to the United States. This, however, would have meant significant British holdings in the South, including virtually all of Georgia and large portions of South Carolina, the North Carolina frontiers, as well as locations in upstate New York and Maine. You would think that the Americans would object. However, somewhat surprisingly, there was little in the way of opposition. The question of exactly why there was not more American pushback to a plan that would have potentially seen a peace settlement that granted the British control over several key holdings in North America seems baffling. Historian Samuel Bemis, in his book, The Diplomacy of the American Revolution, argues that the American Congress was acting out of a position of naive trust, believing that Vergennes and the French were acting with the best interests of the United States in their hearts. Bemis also comments that Le Luzerne, the French minister to the American Congress, appears to have been working closely with Robert Livingston, and may well have been instrumental in helping Livingston get elected to his position as the American Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thus, Livingston may have found himself indebted to Luzerne for his help in securing his election. This seems to be supported by historian Woody Holton in his book Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, where he argues that Le Luzerne was busy handing out bribes, specifically naming John Sullivan, who was now a member of Congress, as a beneficiary of these bribes. Holton likewise points out that Le Luzerne may not have fully disclosed exactly how peace would be achieved, and might have left out some of the details about that whole uti possidetis thing. There were those who did raise an eyebrow and objected to giving the French what amounted to near total control over the peace process. Both John Jay and John Adams argued about the absurdity of granting such a wide sweeping power to the French. More objections would follow after the American victory at Yorktown. However, that is a topic for another episode. On June 15th, Le Luzerne got everything that he was asking for. John Adams, who had been operating as the sole peace representative in Paris, had been originally instructed to not agree to anything that would sever the Union. Now, however, the new instructions were for the Americans to place all negotiating power into the hands of the French, with independence being the only real sticking point for the United States. In this endeavor, Adams would be joined by Benjamin Franklin, Henry Laurens, who was actively a prisoner in the Tower of London, John Jay, who was the unrecognized minister to Spain, and Thomas Jefferson, who would take so long to actually reach Paris that the party was mostly over by the time that he showed up. The United States had agreed to so completely cripple itself in the negotiations that they could not even meet with the British representatives without French consent. As Woody Holton writes, the Americans had essentially turned themselves into a client state of France. Whether it was because of the bribes from Le Luzerne, an overabundance of naivety, or most likely a mixture of the two, the Americans had given a huge amount of power over to the French. Despite this, it is critical to understand that although none of the American allies were necessarily in it for the prosperity of the United States, but rather for more self-serving considerations, the United States was very dependent upon these allies for helping them maintain the war effort, as well as tying up critical British resources that could have otherwise been used against the United States. Although the Spanish failed to actually recognize the existence of a thing called the United States, that does not change the fact that their actions in the war were actively aiding the United States. In May, the Spanish had scored a key victory over the British in Florida. some 6,000 Spanish troops had landed in the area of West Florida, near the modern-day Pensacola, in the early spring of 1781, and set to the task of putting the local British fort under siege. On May 8th, this came to a dramatic end, when, during the kind of routine shelling that comes along with a siege, a Spanish shell hit the British powder magazine. The subsequent explosion killed over 70 British and forced the capitulation of the fort, as well as West Florida as a whole. There were other countries that were aiding the United States but were trying to keep a lower profile, because they did not exactly want the British to know of their involvement. John Adams had been the sole peace minister since the previous year. However, his relationship with the French, and in particular with Vergennes, was anything but ideal. In his role as the peace representative for the United States, Adams ended up sending a series of letters to Vergennes, 7 in total, laying out the American position and their feelings. Some of these were addressing routine matters. Nothing was the slightest bit concerning about those. The problem was that there were other letters which called out the French for not doing enough in the war. Adams unfortunately lacked the diplomatic grace that would have proved invaluable in this situation. This encounter between Adams and Vergennes would become so toxic that the French minister decided to bypass Adams entirely and pass his communication directly to the far easier to work with Benjamin Franklin. Vergennes would, politely, suggest that maybe Adams was not the right guy for this particular job. The advantage of Adams basically being iced out of the process was that suddenly he found himself with some free time on his hands. To fill that time, he decided to head to Amsterdam to see if he could woo the Dutch over to the American cause. Arriving in August 1780, following a bit of sightseeing, Adams got to work. The Dutch had already been aiding the American cause, albeit clandestinely, for years, something that the British would confirm when an American ship carrying Henry Lawrence was intercepted by the British. Within Lawrence's papers was the evidence that the Dutch were aiding the Americans. This is also why, if you were wondering a few moments ago, that Henry Lawrence was now a resident of the Tower of London. Although a formal treaty, as well as recognition of the United States, would not follow until 1782, months after the American victory at Yorktown, the Dutch played a critical role in the American war effort as a major supplier to the American cause. Adams would spend all of 1781 and part of 1782 arguing for a Dutch alliance. The Americans, despite lacking official allies on paper, other than the French, were extremely dependent on these allies during the Revolution. From the Dutch supplying arms to the Spanish and their financial and military support, albeit without joint operations or even recognition. And of course, the French efforts, the Americans were dependent on their support to keep the war going. However, now at the same time, the Americans were at serious risk of reducing themselves to a client of the French. Although peace feelers were out there by the summer of 1781, we are going to come back to the question of peace early next season, when we begin discussing the peace talks which will really amp up in 1782. At the same time that Luzerne was softening up Congress, George Washington was busy making his plans for 1781. Throughout the course of the season, we have seen George Washington become a far more patient man. At the beginning of his command, back in 1775, he had been itching for an assault into Boston. As early as the summer of 75, he had suggested marching the new Continental Army into Boston for an assault, only to be talked down, probably very wisely, by his senior officer corps. The following year, when he got his men up onto the Dorchester Heights, leading to, or more realistically, accelerating the timeline for the evacuation of Boston, there had been a component of his plan that included an invasion of Boston. Now, in time, Washington would figure out that the key to winning the revolution was by keeping an army in the field and avoiding a catastrophic defeat. And to that end, Washington had done a fantastic job at limiting large-scale actions to only a small handful. The problem was that as the epicenter of the war shifted towards the south, Washington found himself growing increasingly restless. New York had become something of a white whale for the general, and he found himself eager to evict the British from the city. As we have discussed, Washington had a few problems, not the least of which was the series of mutinies that January. Possibly the biggest thing holding Washington back from any kind of a major action was the French, who seemed awfully reluctant to join the Americans in a fight. At the beginning of 1781, Washington was waiting on hearing back on just what the French were planning for that year. Although Washington was theoretically in charge, the French were not just going to commit to an engagement without the green light of Versailles. In February, Washington learned that a strong storm had damaged the British Navy blockading the French fleet near Newport, Rhode Island, while at the same time leaving the French largely unharmed. Despite this good fortune, Washington was dismayed to hear that the French only planned to send 4 of their warships to the Chesapeake, hardly the decisive number that the general would have been hoping for. That was, however, until a few weeks later on March 1st, when Washington was pleased to learn that the small fleet had a few successes, which was enough to convince Rochambeau that committing the fleet to an undertaking in Virginia made sense. Wanting to do his part, Washington sent 1,100 troops under Lafayette and ordered him to head to the Chesapeake and rendezvous with the French, who were also providing 1,100 men, in addition to the fleet, for the coming fight. With that in place, Washington set out for a meeting with Rochambeau to make some plans. Okay, so if you are following along with the French naval action in the Chesapeake, first, they sent a meager force that had some success, which, that was a whole lot of fun, and was enough to convince Rochambeau that a bigger naval victory might be even more awesome, which is why he sent the rest of the fleet to join in. The plan was to head off to the east and then drop south, rather than taking the direct route through the far more patrolled waters along the coast. The British would never see the French coming. Unfortunately, the British saw it coming and were there to greet the French. Although the battle was rather indecisive, both sides took damage. The French decided that was enough naval fun for one day and quickly retreated back to the north to the safety of Rhode Island. Now, obviously, that was not ideal. But at the end of the day, the French Navy had not been completely destroyed, which, hey, that was something of a silver lining. This, however, did bring up the question of what exactly the Americans should do next. Washington, being George Washington, was still favoring an action in New York, whereas the French were seemingly more interested in a move to the south. Heading through the spring and towards the summer of 1781, you had a situation where seemingly everybody was trying to find their footing. The Americans in the north were busy staring wistfully at the occupied New York. In the south, the war had shifted to Virginia, as the British control over the Carolinas increasingly collapsed. We are going to spend a lot of time today with George Washington, but I think to fully understand what we are talking about next, you have to understand the state of affairs for the British. We had discussed last week that Cornwallis had made the decision to abandon the Carolinas and to relocate the war to Virginia. What we had not talked about is the fact that Cornwallis had decided to test that old adage that it is better to ask forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. Henry Clinton, the guy who was actually in charge of the war effort in North America, was caught completely off guard by Cornwallis deciding to abandon the Carolinas. Clinton was, understandably, unhappy with the news. However, it did open up a possibility for him, one that would in turn infuriate Cornwallis. You see, Clinton was not really sure what 1781 was going to bring. He was well aware that Washington was looking at New York, and that he might try something. Likewise, he was aware that despite having repulsed the French fleet in March, the French had sailed a large fleet that had left the same month from Europe. The British had made no efforts to stop said fleet, which meant that they were now sailing unopposed towards North America. Knowing that these ships were on the way, Clinton sent instructions in early June to Cornwallis, telling him that his primary mission is to not get caught up in another major engagement, and instead find a place in the Chesapeake where the British ships might be able to shelter safely when the French fleet arrived. Oh, and by the way, since you don't need those troops anymore, since you're going to be avoiding large engagements, be on the lookout for another letter where I'm going to peel off a large chunk of your already depleted army to move to New York for a possible offensive. It probably goes without saying that Cornwallis was not exactly enthusiastic about having Clinton built for his men. After all, had he not just limped into Virginia to reinforce his increasingly beleaguered army? Now you just want to strip that all away? From Clinton's perspective, he had already told Cornwallis to pretty much lay low and avoid large engagements, so the need for a large army was no longer critical. However, it did nothing to repair that relationship between Clinton and Cornwallis. Although he did follow orders and began scouting out a location to shelter ships, he was deeply upset by the request and actually wrote to Clinton, asking if he could move back south to Charleston. Part of the surprise at Clinton's request may well stem from the fact that Cornwallis had not simply been sitting back since his arrival in Virginia. When Cornwallis reached Virginia, he did rendezvous with Arnold, taking command over the troops that had previously been under Arnold's control. Soon after his arrival, Cornwallis quickly got to the task of taking care of the Americans inside of Virginia. For the Americans, Baron von Steuben had been in Virginia for the last several months, having stayed there with a garrison while traveling south with Greene back the previous summer. Washington, likewise, as we discussed earlier, had sent Lafayette down to the south as well. Overall, though, it was Cornwallis who found success in early June. Now, these were not exactly large-scale battles that would equal the American success at Cowpens or Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis was not exactly evening out the score here. However, Cornwallis was doing a good job of causing Americans headaches that June. The British had managed to run Lafayette and his men out of Richmond. Von Steuben was faced with stopping a British raid led by Colonel John Simcoe and the Queen's Rangers. Very quickly, Steuben's men decided that fighting did not sound like a great time, forcing him to withdraw from his position without offering any resistance at all. In a very near disaster for the Americans, Barristan Tarleton moved on Charlottesville on June 4th with the objective of capturing the Virginia legislature. He very nearly succeeded in capturing Thomas Jefferson, who escaped with only minutes to spare. Several members of the Virginia legislature, including Daniel Boone, were captured and briefly detained. Knowing this, it becomes somewhat more understandable as to why Cornwallis was so thoroughly upset with the request to peel off men. Yeah, sure, it had been a rough start to the year, but for the first time in a while he was, at a minimum, causing the Americans to scramble a bit. Now, Clinton wanted to just roll in and put that all to an end. Cornwallis would learn of Clinton's request upon arriving in Williamsburg on June 25th. The question here turns to exactly why Clinton was wanting to take what amounted to roughly half of Cornwallis's army and move it north to a theater that had largely stalled out. Clinton may have been operating under the impression that Washington, aided by a French fleet, was making plans for an attack on New York City. Part of the problem here is that Clinton seems to have underestimated the risk to Cornwallis from Lafayette's army in Virginia. Historian Woody Holton writes that Clinton believed that Cornwallis outnumbered Lafayette by a substantial margin. It was indeed the worst kind of overestimation because Clinton believed that Lafayette was operating with a much smaller army, and that Cornwallis was operating with a much larger army. In reality, both armies were roughly the same size. If Cornwallis should send the minimum 2,000 troops to Clinton, he would be granting Lafayette a substantial advantage. In his defense, Henry Clinton did have good reason to believe that Washington was planning an attack on New York. We have already talked about the fact that Washington continued to view New York as the key to everything. Although the epicenter of the revolution now appeared to be in Virginia, much closer to Washington's home, his eyes remained fixed on the Hudson. Washington biographer John Farrelling writes that following the war, Washington would engage in a bit of retcon, claiming that his preoccupation with New York was always a clever ruse to pin the British down. He knew that the real fight was in the South. If you still believe that myth of Washington somehow being unable to lie, this probably should dissuade you from that idea. Washington was, as it turns out, quite capable of lying. If Washington was preoccupied with New York, despite his later claims that he was faking it, he was in an ever-increasing minority. Even as early as that spring, when Rochambeau and Washington met to plan for the summer's campaigns, Rochambeau did his best to push the general towards the South. Nominally, Rochambeau was deferring to Washington. However, he could clearly see that the key to the war was in Virginia, not New York. Washington argued that New York remained an important target, and that any march all the way to the south to Virginia would be a difficult and costly affair. Now, more on point, Washington also argued that by moving troops into position to attack New York, it would force Clinton to pull troops from Cornwallis in order to reinforce the city. Rochambeau, with what I can only assume to have been a deep sigh of reluctant acceptance, agreed to Washington's planned assault of New York. By the time that June rolled around, Washington was stuck waiting for the French to arrive, annoyed by their slow progress. There was seemingly little he could do until de Grasse showed up with that French fleet that had sailed earlier in the year from France. Conveniently for the Americans, Washington had actually managed to create something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Recall that he had argued months earlier to Rochambeau that any assault on New York would necessitate that Clinton recall men from Cornwallis down in Virginia. We know that in June, this is exactly what happened, with Clinton requesting nearly half of Cornwallis's army. Clinton had weeks earlier, right before making that fateful request, intercepted letters from Washington that featured him laying out his plans for a joint American and French assault on New York. Recognizing the danger that he could soon find himself in, Clinton decided to recall those troops. Thus, albeit by accident, Washington had managed to prove his point about the British calling for reinforcements from the South. In July, as he continued to wait listlessly for the French to arrive, Washington learned that the British had sent a large foraging party south into New Jersey. This meant that New York was undermanned, or at least as compared to usual. Believing that this was his moment, Washington quickly put together a complex three-pronged attack. One prong had the Americans crossing the Hudson and landing near the modern-day Bronx. A second column attacked down the Hudson to Kings Bridge, and then he had the French hitting them from the east. His thought was that if the Americans could establish a foothold along the perimeter of the city, they would be well established for their thrust into the interior of the city, likely in the form of a siege. As much as I would love to discuss the chances that this would have worked, at the end of the day it amounted to little more than a feeble attempt by the Americans. There were problems from the start, chiefly that Washington had no idea where de Grasse was actually planning to land. For a siege to take place in New York, the French Navy was going to be required. Unfortunately, Washington was not exactly certain what the plans of the French Navy were. Should de Grasse decide that the Chesapeake was a better target, which, it was, then Washington could potentially find himself high and dry on his planned invasion. Although the French Navy was still absent, on the night of July 2nd, Washington made up his mind that with so much of the British Army off in New Jersey, he needed to seize his moment. The plan was for Benjamin Lincoln to land with some 800 elite troops on the northern tip of Manhattan. A few hours later, a second force would attack a Loyalist militia holding under the command of James Delancey in the modern-day Bronx. This division would be under the command of the Duc de Lauzon, who incidentally had yet to actually arrive, but ever the optimist, Washington felt good that they would make it in time. The battle, if that is what we really want to call it, really should be little more than a footnote. Lincoln did some reconnoitering and quickly decided that landing on the northern tip of the island was a no-go. Instead, he pivoted over to Plan B, which involved landing further north and providing support for Luzon. The problem, as you may have already guessed, is that despite the optimism from Washington, Luzon did not arrive in time. Making matters worse, the British had discovered Lincoln and were busy running him off, forcing a late Luzon to provide cover for the now fleeing Lincoln. This ignominious moment would prove to be Washington's last attempt to recapture New York. Despite this setback, Washington was not done dreaming about New York just yet. When Rochambeau arrived on July 6, Washington was still busily making plans for an assault. To his credit, Rochambeau would play along for the next month, as he participated in scouting missions with Washington and spent the month busily making plans for an assault on New York, all the while whispering kindly in his ear that Virginia sounded like a pretty cool place to visit, and reminding him that amphibious landings were fraught with danger. Towards the end of July, de Grasse finally poured cold water on Washington's plans. De Grasse had actually spent the last few months racking up victories in the Caribbean, which is great. Unfortunately, he wrote that he had decided that he was not going to be coming to New York, and that instead the Chesapeake was going to be the target. George Washington, indignant as he might have felt, understood that it was over. He was not going to be taking New York. There would be no battle for the city that had so completely consumed him since 1776. With a deep, resigned sigh, in early August, Washington and Rochambeau began the process of moving a combined army of 7,500 troops south towards Virginia. As the American and French armies began their march to the south, it seems that Clinton too realized that the war was in fact shifting towards Virginia. That massive troop transfer that had so infuriated Cornwallis was canceled. However, it was ironically some bad luck for Washington that would help keep more British troops stuck in New York. Remember those letters that Clinton had captured detailing Washington's plan to invade New York? Well, he was apparently still under the impression that the Americans were planning something. Washington, playing right into this fear, set up a fake camp near Sandy Hook, complete with bread ovens and evidence of the Americans settling down. This, combined with those earlier letters, meant that Clinton remained in New York, anticipating Washington's next move, longer than he otherwise would have. For the first time since 1776, Washington had cast his eyes away from New York. He had set out on a 350-mile march towards the south that would, unbeknownst to Washington, change the outcome of the war. Next time, we are going to head back to the south, as Lord Cornwallis becomes increasingly nervous about his situation. Until then, I hope you all have a fantastic 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you all back here next time, as Cornwallis gets backed into a corner.